Our guest today is Stéphane Voisin, Head of Sustainability, Research and Responsible Investment at Kepler Chevreux. Together we will talk about the financial drivers of CSR from an investor's perspective. Thank you so much for joining us today. Stéphane, you have been one of the pioneers of responsible investment in France and in Europe. You have been involved in this field for many years. You have seen it evolved and developed. In a few words, could you tell us what is responsible investment about?
Thank you. Responsible investment is basically an approach for investment that covers many fields and many approaches. First one is obviously trying to be responsible when investing, meaning trying to meet a number of criteria, responsibility criteria towards environmental, social and ethical issues. Then it divides in many different practices. One is exclusion, another one is inclusion or best in class. I mean, making sure that we're not excluding any sectors upfront, and trying to take out of every sector the best companies in terms of their practices, in terms of their performance on environmental or social issues. The third one is ESG integration. ESG stands for environmental, social and governance, and the objective is to make sure that we integrate within financial models those indicators, environmental, social, governance indicators that can help investors to better understand the risk profile of the companies or the asset they invest in. The last one, I would say, is more impact investment, and this is about also taking this issue into account, but making sure that we can produce a non-financial return, environmental, social returns from those investments.
Do all investors integrate CSR or the so-called ESG aspects?
Not all investors integrate ESG investors, not all investors are impact investors. I think it's important to define that today the pure SRI, which I call also impact investor, are probably a minority. I would probably say that's around 5% of the market, of the equity market, but probably a bit less on the fixed income market. ESG integration, which I defined previously as integrating all these issues but with financial benefit, not necessarily with the motivation of having an environmental or social impact, is a much stronger approach, which is basically today represent about 30 to 35% of the market. So certainly not all of them. This is more the case of long-term investors, insurance companies, asset owners, but it is growing fast, and this approach makes obviously a lot of sense in this volatile market. And
CSR critics have argued that CSR is expensive, it's a cost, and the potential benefits are only experienced in a distant future, if it occurs at all. Why would investors value CSR, and how do they value it?
So there are, as I said, there are two different approaches. For investors which are basically integrating ESG into their assets as a way to mitigate potential risk, this makes sense fundamentally. Basically, they do recognize that taking into account only financial indicators does not fully capture the risk profile or the value potential of a company, of an asset. And therefore, in order to have an holistic view of the risk profile of these assets, they have to integrate also non-financial indicators, such as environmental ones, climate change, biodiversity, governance one, remuneration systems. So they're in a better position to capture the risk profile of companies and their value potential. So basically, there may be an additional cost of integrating these issues, but potentially it mitigates the risk of accident for these companies, and they are in a better position to understand issues which are becoming now dominant to the marketplace.
Risk mitigation is an important aspect of how ESG can create value.
Risk mitigation is one of the critical aspects. That's why it's also very relevant for fixed income investors and not so much also as for equity investors, because fundamentally fixed income investors are risk adverse type of investors, and they fundamentally also their role as investor is to mitigate risk, solvency risk from their assets, and basically looking at ESG issue for them makes a lot of sense.
There has been quite a lot of studies on the performance of responsible investment funds, but can we say that funds integrating ESG criteria are outperforming conventional funds?
There are lots of studies about the potential correlation between performance, financial performance, and CSR or SRI performance. They basically do not conclude. We've run some meta-theses on that, and they are not very conclusive at this stage, except within a few areas. And one I was mentioning earlier is on fixed income. For example, it has been made pretty clear that a very good corporate governance and a very good company with a very good governance structures and with high rating in that direction is more, let's say, companies with good governance is more likely to have a lower credit spread attached to it, and basically be perceived as a lower risk to invest than any other companies. So there have been some study in this area, but it's been very difficult to demonstrate. And anyway, we believe that the objective of CSR, integrating CSR or ESG or SRI issue with investment is not so much about trying to better perform it, but it's trying to avoid risk and to have more stable assets. That's why also it is very important, if we want to drive more stable financial market, more responsible market, we believe it is key for any investors to integrate these issues, because obviously if everyone do so, and if all investors keep asking the right questions to companies and to their assets, it could be also to governments potentially, we'll be probably in a better position to mitigate this type of risk, to focus on longer terms, and to have more stable financial markets.
We have talked about how integrating ESG or CSR create value for investors. But is responsible investment also creating value for society?
Yes, obviously, as I described, there are two types of approaches. If you're talking about SRI or impact of investment, the consequence of that is obvious. There is a clear motivation of the investor to have an impact which goes beyond the financial of the return. So basically they are looking for environmental return and social return on their investment, and they want to be able to measure that clearly. For the rest of the market, ESG integration, the motivation is highly a financial one. So it's they are self-interested in basically looking at issues which are not anecdotal anymore, which are becoming dominant, and they will be basically not respecting their fiduciary duty if they will not integrate them. But let's say that I'm pretty optimistic on that side, and if a number of large institutions and a larger proportion of all investors are starting to ask to all the assets, to all the corporates, to all the issuers about the sustainability of their business model, about their human capital performance, about their environmental impact and the cost of that, obviously that will have an impact because it's a form of engagement on those companies, and ultimately that will have an impact, and it is much stronger case than if only the SRI or the impact investors niche are asking these questions. If at the end of the day you get probably 40% of the market asking those questions regularly to CEOs, CFOs, and to all the companies they invest in, obviously it will have an impact because they are the shareholders of the companies, they have a word to say, and the companies will react. And they will probably start to report better on these issues. And once the reporting is implemented, they will obviously try to make some progress in this area. So I would say more indirectly, but yes, they should have an impact.
Our last question deals with recommendations for companies embedding CSR. One of the challenges is the communication between companies and financial analysts. What should companies do to have their CSR approach understood and valued by the financial market?
It's an important point. I believe that not enough companies are communicating proactively on their extra financial performance. I think it's only a way for companies to be perceived differently by the marketplace. And we believe that if the financial community also have access to longer term issues, to communication on intangibles of the companies, the market itself, through the analysts, are more likely to have a longer term view on the companies than if they are only provided with financial statements and balance sheets. So it's probably a good way for the companies to make sure that actually to upgrade the horizon of the analyst and make sure that the investor will try to evaluate the companies not on the short-term benefit and risk only, but also on a longer-term view, through mainly intangibles, but also through the management of our human capital, through their good governance. So that's definitely a critical point. And we don't see enough companies on the road meeting SRI investors, but as well it's early stage in this momentum. And some countries like France or some Nordic countries have a proactive regulation to incentivize companies to do so. And we are now waiting for a new directive in Europe calling for all European companies to integrate non-financial indicators within their annual report. And obviously this is the kind of right signals we need, and I think it will be beneficiary for all companies at the end of the day.
Thank you, Stéphane. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.